The snow fell on Manhattan like a whispered apology, each flake catching the amber glow of streetlights before dissolving into the wet pavement below. Christmas Eve had transformed the Upper East Side into something approaching a postcard, though Victoria Sterling had long stopped noticing such things. Beauty required attention, and attention was a currency she could not afford to spend on anything that did not advance her position in the world she had clawed her way into. The black Lincoln Navigator pulled to a stop outside the Gilded Oak, its tinted windows reflecting the restaurant's facade like a dark mirror. Victoria checked her phone one final time, scanning the confirmation email from Richard Caldwell's office. The meeting was set. The numbers were prepared. Everything hinged on the next 4 hours. Beside her, Lillian Sterling sat motionless, her small fingers wrapped around a worn teddy bear with mismatched button eyes. The bear's name was Mr. Buttons, though Victoria could not remember when or why her daughter had chosen that name. There were many things about Lily that Victoria could not remember, details lost in the avalanche of quarterly reports and board meetings and investor calls that had consumed the past 8 years. Victoria smoothed the front of her Valentino dress, black silk, that cost more than most people earned in a month. The choice had been deliberate. Black projected authority. Black did not apologize. Tonight she needed every advantage she could manufacture because Douglas Harrington would be watching for any sign of weakness, and her daughter represented the largest vulnerability in her carefully constructed armor. The driver opened the door and cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and exhaust. Victoria stepped out first, her Louboutin heels clicking against the salted sidewalk. She turned and extended her hand to Lily, who took it with the mechanical compliance of a child who had learned that resistance only prolonged uncomfortable situations. Lily's red velvet dress had been selected by Victoria's assistant, chosen because it matched the Christmas theme and would photograph well if any press happened to be present. The matching ribbon in her daughter's brown curls had already begun to slip, tilting at an angle that suggested either rebellion or indifference. Victoria reached down to adjust it, and Lily flinched almost imperceptibly at the touch. The moment passed. Victoria straightened and led her daughter toward the restaurant's entrance, where a doorman in a burgundy coat held the glass door open with practiced deference. Inside, the Gilded Oak had transformed itself into a temple of excess. A Christmas tree towered near the entrance, its branches heavy with gold ornaments and white lights that cast dancing shadows across the marble floor. Crystal chandeliers scattered prismatic light across silk wallpaper and polished mahogany. Jazz interpretations of Christmas carols drifted from hidden speakers, sophisticated enough to suggest culture without demanding attention. Victoria scanned the room with the efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. The VIP section occupied the far corner, partially screened by frosted glass panels etched with oak leaves. She could see figures moving behind the glass silhouettes of power brokers and decision-makers whose opinions would determine whether Sterling Technologies survived the next fiscal quarter. Lily's grip tightened on Mr. Buttons, and Victoria glanced down to find her daughter's eyes darting across the crowded space. The hearing aids nestled in Lily's ears would be struggling to process the cacophony of sounds transforming conversation and music and clinking glasses into an undifferentiated wall of noise. Victoria knew this intellectually in the same way she knew the specifications of any system she was responsible for managing. She had read the audiologist's reports. She had approved the purchase of the most advanced hearing aids available. What she had never done was ask Lily what it actually felt like to exist in a world designed for people who could hear. A waiter approached with champagne on a silver tray. Victoria took a glass without breaking stride, leaving Lily to navigate the forest of adult legs in designer gowns alone. The champagne was Dom Perignon 2008. Victoria noted this detail because details mattered, because the choice of vintage signaled something about the evening's stakes that words could not convey. The hostess materialized beside them, a young woman with a practiced smile and eyes that assessed Victoria's net worth in a single glance. "Right this way, Mrs. Sterling, the party is expecting you." Victoria did not correct the assumption embedded in the title. She had never been anyone's Mrs. had raised Lily alone since the girl's father disappeared 3 months after the diagnosis, unable to reconcile his expectations of fatherhood with the reality of a child who would never hear him say he loved her. They wove between tables where couples leaned close and families laughed, and business partners sealed deals over Dover sole and filet mignon. Lily kept pace, her small feet moving quickly to match her mother's determined stride. Twice, she nearly collided with waiters carrying loaded trays. Victoria did not slow down. The VIP section opened before them like the inner sanctum of a cathedral, quieter than the main dining room, but no less charged with significance. 8 people occupied the central table, their faces illuminated by candles that flickered in crystal holders. Victoria recognized each of them from photographs and dossiers, mental files she had compiled over months of preparation for this moment. Douglas Harrington sat at the head of the table, his silver hair catching the candlelight like a crown he had appointed himself to wear. At 58, he had the cultivated appearance of old money, though Victoria knew his family's fortune had been built on the backs of workers in factories that had long since moved overseas. His smile as she approached contained the warmth of a winter sun, bright and distant and incapable of providing any real heat. Victoria. Douglas rose from his chair, buttoning his jacket with the fluid motion of a man who had spent decades performing wealth. Radiant as always. And this must be Lillian. He did not crouch to address the child. He did not extend his hand. His gaze passed over Lily like she was furniture, an accessory to be noted and dismissed. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she could not immediately identify. Later, she would recognize it as the first crack in a foundation she had believed to be solid. Douglas Victoria replied, her voice calibrated to project confidence without aggression. Thank you for arranging this evening. The other board members rose in a cascade of handshakes and air kisses, each greeting weighted with subtext Victoria could read as easily as a financial statement. There was Robert Crane Douglas's most reliable ally, whose eyes flickered to his phone every 30 seconds, as if expecting news of some imminent disaster. Margaret Whitmore sat near the end of the table, her white hair swept back in an elegant chignon, observing the proceedings with an expression that revealed nothing of her intentions. And then there was Richard Caldwell. He did not rise when Victoria approached. He simply watched his bourbon-colored eyes, taking in details others would miss, cataloging information in some private ledger of human character. At 62, Caldwell had earned his reputation as one of the most astute investors in American technology. He did not chase trends or follow crowds. He invested in people, which made him either Victoria's greatest opportunity or her most dangerous threat. Mrs. Sterling. His voice carried the gravel of age and cigarettes abandoned too late. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Victoria took the seat Gerald Morrison indicated, the restaurant's manager, hovering at her elbow with the attentive anxiety of a man whose career depended on every detail of the evening proceeding flawlessly. Lily was guided to a chair beside her mother, positioned at the corner of the table where she could be present without demanding attention. Meredith Walsh appeared at Victoria's shoulder before she had finished unfolding her napkin. The PR director's platinum hair gleamed under the chandeliers cut in sharp angles that matched the precision of her professional demeanor. She leaned close, her perfume expensive and her whisper urgent. 15 minutes to circulate, then we should move Lily somewhere more comfortable. The private dining room on the second floor is available. She'll have iPad access, and the noise level will be more manageable. Victoria heard what Meredith did not say. The child was a liability, a variable that could not be controlled, a source of potential embarrassment in front of people who would judge Sterling Technologies by the CEO's ability to manage all aspects of her life with equal competence. Across the table, Douglas observed this whispered conference with barely concealed satisfaction. He had never explicitly stated that Victoria's role as a single mother made her unsuitable for corporate leadership. He did not need to. The implication lived in every raised eyebrow, every pointed question about work-life balance, every suggestion that perhaps Victoria was spreading herself too thin. Jonathan Hayes stood near the bar, his gray suit unremarkable among the evening's designer wardrobes. Victoria's attorney held a whiskey he had not touched, his eyes fixed on Douglas with the patient focus of a predator, waiting for prey to make a mistake. Jonathan had warned her that something was building, that Douglas had been cultivating alliances and planting seeds of doubt throughout the board. What Jonathan lacked was proof sufficient to act upon. Richard Caldwell lifted his glass and the table fell silent. To Christmas Eve, he said, and to the conversations that will shape the coming year. Glasses clinked around the table. Victoria sipped her champagne without tasting it, her attention split between the investors she needed to impress and the child she was failing to notice. Lily had positioned Mr. Buttons on the table, turning the bear to face her, as if seeking comfort from the only friend who required nothing from her in return. The arrangement of faces around the table shifted as conversations broke into smaller clusters. Victoria found herself drawn into a discussion of market projections with Margaret Whitmore, whose questions revealed a sharper mind than her grandmotherly appearance suggested. Douglas circulated like a host rather than a guest, his hand finding shoulders and his laugh punctuating anecdotes Victoria could not hear, but could imagine in precise detail. Minutes passed. The appetizers arrived and departed. Victoria answered questions and asked her own performing the elaborate dance of corporate courtship with the skill of someone who had learned every step through observation rather than instruction. She was discussing supply chain optimization with Robert Crane when she noticed the empty chair beside her. Lily was gone. The realization struck Victoria like ice water, shocking her out of the professional trance she had inhabited since arriving. She scanned the VIP section first, then the visible portions of the main dining room. No red velvet dress, no brown curls. No teddy bear with mismatched eyes. Victoria's hand found Meredith's arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks. Where is she? The words were not a question, but a command. Meredith's composure flickered genuine confusion, replacing professional polish. She was right there. I saw her a moment ago. Douglas turned at the commotion, his expression arranging itself into concern that did not reach his eyes. Is everything all right, Victoria? You seem troubled. The room felt suddenly smaller. The elegant crowd transformed into obstacles between Victoria and her missing daughter. She stood without excusing herself, her champagne glass, forgotten her presentation, notes irrelevant. 8 years of treating Lily like a problem to be solved had not prepared her for the visceral terror of not knowing where her child was. She found herself moving toward the main dining room, then reversing course toward the restrooms, then stopping in the middle of the floor like a compass that had lost north. Somewhere in this restaurant, her 8-year-old daughter was alone, unable to call for help in any way that strangers would understand. And then Victoria heard it. The sound stopped her mid-stride, freezing her beside a potted fern whose leaves brushed her bare shoulder. Laughter. Not the polished laughter of adults performing amusement for social advantage, but something else entirely. Something pure and unguarded and achingly familiar. Lily's laugh. Victoria had not heard that sound in months, perhaps longer. She had grown so accustomed to her daughter's silence, to the careful smiles Lily offered like currency to satisfy adult expectations, that she had forgotten what genuine joy sounded like emerging from her child's throat. The laughter came from somewhere deeper in the restaurant, beyond the main dining room, from a corridor marked with a discreet sign reading staff only. Victoria moved toward the sound without conscious decision, her heels clicking against the marble in rhythm with her accelerating heartbeat. The corridor was narrow, lit by fluorescent fixtures that hummed at a frequency Victoria could hear, but Lily could not. Doors lined both walls, most of them closed, labeled with words like maintenance and electrical and storage. The laughter grew louder as Victoria approached a junction where the corridor split in two directions. She chose left, following intuition or desperation or some maternal instinct she had not known she possessed. The corridor opened into a small alcove outside a door marked Maintenance, Authorized Personnel Only, and there, seated on the cold tile floor in her expensive velvet dress, was Lily. Victoria stopped breathing. Her daughter was not alone. A man in a gray maintenance uniform knelt beside her, his back to Victoria, his hands moving in patterns she did not recognize. Beside him sat a boy of perhaps 10 years, sandy-haired and thin, his own hands mirroring the man's movements. And Lily, her Lily was responding with gestures of her own, her face animated in ways Victoria had not seen since before the diagnosis, before the hearing aids, before the parade of specialists who had turned her daughter into a medical file rather than a person. They were signing. The realization crashed through Victoria's consciousness with the force of revelation. They were speaking to Lily in her own language, communicating without sound, connecting across barriers that Victoria had never even attempted to cross. The man turned his hand in a circular motion near his chest, and Lily mimicked the gesture. The boy added something with quick fingers, and Lily responded with a sign that made both of them smile. Then the boy gestured elaborately, his expression theatrical, and Lily's laugh rang out again, filling the corridor with a sound Victoria had convinced herself she would never hear again. Graham Callahan had arrived at the Gilded Oak at 5 o'clock that afternoon, 3 hours before the VIP event was scheduled to begin. His job was simple: verify that the electrical systems could handle the evening's demands, check the audio equipment, and disappear before the wealthy guests arrived to remind him of his place in the world. He had brought Wyatt because he had no other choice. The after-school program closed at 4 on holidays. His mother-in-law was in Florida. His neighbors had their own families to attend to on Christmas Eve. Graham had explained the situation to Gerald Morrison, the restaurant's manager, with the quiet dignity of a man who had long ago stopped apologizing for the circumstances of his life. Wyatt would stay in the staff break room, Graham had promised. The boy would not make noise, would not wander, would not remind anyone that the man responsible for their evening's comfort was also a single father struggling to hold his world together. Gerald had agreed with visible reluctance, his eyes communicating the consequences that would follow any disruption. Graham had accepted the terms because accepting unfavorable terms was how men like him survived in a world built for men like Douglas Harrington. The electrical panel had checked out perfectly at 5:15. Graham had documented every reading, every connection, every fail-safe, his handwriting neat in the maintenance log that no one would ever read unless something went wrong. He took pride in thoroughness, even when thoroughness was neither noticed nor rewarded. He had found the girl at 7:20, standing in the corridor outside the maintenance closet like a small ghost in red velvet. Her eyes were too old for her face, watchful in the way of children who had learned that the world was not designed with their needs in mind. Graham had noticed the hearing aids immediately, the small devices nestled in her ears like technological prayers for normalcy. He had knelt to her level, slowly making sure she could see him approach, giving her time to retreat if she chose. His hand had moved to his chest, palm flat, then rotated outward. Hello. The sign was simple, universal, one of the first things he had learned in those desperate months when Wyatt's silence had been his only companion. The girl's eyes had widened, her suspicion transforming into something Graham recognized. Hope. The dangerous, fragile hope of someone who had stopped expecting to be understood. He had signed again. My name is Graham. What is your name? Her response came hesitantly, her fingers forming letters he had to concentrate to follow. Lily. Wyatt had appeared, then drawn by curiosity or boredom, or the instinct that connected children across the barriers adults constructed between them. Graham's son had never fully lost the sign language they had learned together during his months of deafness, using it now as a secret code, a private language between father and son that excluded the hearing world as thoroughly as that world had once excluded Wyatt. The boy had taken over the conversation with the social confidence Graham had never possessed, signing to Lily about Christmas trees and paper snowflakes and the elaborate mythology of Santa Claus. Lily had responded with increasing animation, her hands moving faster as she discovered that this stranger's son could understand every word she offered. Graham had watched them communicate, two children bridging the gap between sound and silence with an ease that shamed the adult world. He had thought about Catherine, his wife, who had died too young, who had insisted they learn sign language together even after Wyatt's hearing returned, who had understood that the bridge they had built should never be abandoned just because the immediate need had passed. And then Lily had laughed, and Graham had known with sudden certainty that this child was starving for exactly what Catherine had given Wyatt: not treatment, not accommodation, not the well-meaning interventions of specialists who saw disability before they saw humanity, just connection, just the simple, profound gift of being understood. Victoria stood in the corridor watching her daughter communicate with strangers and felt the architecture of her self-image begin to crumble. For 8 years, she had told herself a story about her parenting. She had worked hard to provide for Lily. She had hired the best therapists, purchased the most advanced technology, enrolled her daughter in the most prestigious programs for children with hearing impairments. She had done everything right according to every metric she knew how to measure, but she had never learned to sign. The excuse had always been time, the acquisition that demanded weekends, the crisis that canceled vacations, the board meeting that conflicted with Lily's school recital. Victoria had delegated her daughter's communication needs to professionals because she was too busy building an empire to learn the language her child actually spoke. Now she watched a maintenance worker in a uniform that probably cost less than her earrings demonstrate more fluency in that language than Victoria had achieved in nearly a decade of motherhood. His hands moved with patience and precision, shaping meanings she could not decode, building connections she had never attempted to construct. The man turned slightly, and Victoria saw his face for the first time. Mid-40s, she guessed. brown hair silvering at the temples, eyes the color of sea glass, pale green with flecks of gray, holding an expression she could not immediately classify. When he noticed her standing at the edge of the alcove, those eyes did not widen with surprise or narrow with suspicion. They simply acknowledged her presence with the calm assessment of someone who had long ago stopped being intimidated by expensive clothes and imperious postures. He signed something to Lily, his gesture slow and deliberate. Victoria could not read the words, but she understood the meaning from context. "Your mother is here?" Lily turned and Victoria watched her daughter's face transform. The animation drained away like water from a broken vessel, replaced by the careful blankness Lily had perfected for interactions with the hearing world. The joy Victoria had glimpsed from the corridor retreated behind walls her daughter had built for protection against people exactly like her mother. The maintenance worker rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, surprisingly graceful for a man of his size. His son followed, positioning himself slightly behind his father in a gesture of solidarity that made Victoria's chest ache with something she refused to identify as jealousy. "She is safe," the man said, his voice low and unhurried. She was exploring. Kids do that even when they are supposed to stay put. Victoria opened her mouth to respond and found that her prepared words, the phrases she had rehearsed for every conceivable social situation, were entirely inadequate for this moment. What emerged instead was raw and unscripted and more honest than anything she had said in years. She was laughing. I heard her laughing. The man nodded as if this were the most natural observation in the world. "She has a good sense of humor." "Your daughter. She told us a joke about a penguin and a snowman. Took me a minute to get it, but Wyatt here figured it out right away." Lily told a joke. The concept seemed impossible, a report from some alternate reality where Victoria's daughter was not the silent, careful child who moved through the world like an apology for existing. I did not know she knew any jokes. Something shifted in the man's expression, a flicker of emotion he did not quite manage to suppress. "There is a lot she knows. She just needs someone who speaks her language to hear it." The words landed like a blow Victoria had not seen coming. She felt her posture stiffen, her defenses rising automatically against the implied criticism. "Who are you to tell me about my own daughter?" The question formed in her mind but did not reach her lips, stopped by some mechanism she did not fully understand. Instead, she found herself looking at Lily, really looking in a way she had not done in months. Her daughter stood between the maintenance worker and his son, like she belonged there, like she had found her people in this fluorescent-lit corridor, like the expensive private schools and specialized therapists and custom-fitted hearing aids had all been pointing her toward this accidental encounter with a stranger in a gray uniform. Mr. Buttons dangled from Lily's left hand, forgotten for the first time since Victoria could remember. Her daughter's attention was focused entirely on the boy Wyatt, who was signing something about Christmas ornaments made from bottle caps and colored paper. Lily's fingers moved in response, and Victoria watched the conversation happen in a language she had never bothered to learn. The weight of that failure settled onto Victoria's shoulders like a physical burden, pressing down on the careful compartments where she stored her guilt and her doubt and her fear of being inadequate. She had built an empire because she could not stand the thought of her daughter growing up poor the way Victoria had. She had sacrificed everything for security and success in the illusion of control. And somehow in the process, she had failed to notice that her daughter was drowning in a sea of silence Victoria had never tried to enter. "Thank you." The words surprised Victoria as much as they seemed to surprise the maintenance worker. "Thank you for talking to her, for listening." He studied her for a moment, his pale eyes reading something in her face that she was not aware of revealing. "You can learn," he said finally. "Sign language. It is not too late." Victoria's throat tightened around a response she could not articulate. 8 years. 8 years of specialists and therapies and technological interventions, and not once had anyone suggested that the solution might be as simple as Victoria herself learning to communicate with her daughter. Or perhaps they had suggested it and she had not been ready to hear. "I should take her back," Victoria managed. "The dinner. There are people waiting." The man nodded, stepping aside to clear a path back toward the main restaurant. His son moved with him, a coordinated unit, and Victoria noticed for the first time how similar their postures were, how the boy had clearly learned to carry himself by watching his father navigate the world. She stepped forward, extending her hand toward Lily, expecting the automatic compliance that had characterized their physical interactions for years. But Lily did not move immediately. Instead, she turned to the maintenance worker and signed something Victoria could not understand, her small fingers forming shapes that held meaning Victoria was excluded from accessing. The man smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. He signed back, and Lily's response was to reach out and squeeze his hand briefly before turning to take her mother's waiting palm. The contact of Lily's fingers against Victoria's sent an unexpected current through her nervous system. When had she last held her daughter's hand for any reason other than logistics? When had touch between them been anything other than functional means of transportation rather than connection? Victoria led Lily back through the corridor, past the maintenance closet and the storage rooms and the humming fluorescent lights, toward the warmth and noise and performance of the VIP dinner that awaited them. But something had shifted in the space between her ribs, a tectonic movement she could not yet name but could not ignore. Behind her, Graham Callahan watched the expensive woman lead her daughter away, his expression troubled in ways he would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked. He had seen something in that child's face, a hunger he recognized from his own son's eyes during those terrible months when Wyatt had been trapped in silence. The hunger to be understood, the desperate need to be seen. He turned back to the electrical panel he had come to check, pushing thoughts of lonely little girls in velvet dresses to the back of his mind. He had a job to finish, a son to watch, a life to maintain on the margins of a world that had never made space for people like him. But as he opened the panel and saw what waited inside, all thoughts of anything else evaporated in a rush of professional alarm. The connections had been altered. Graham had checked this exact panel 2 hours ago, had documented every wire and every junction with the meticulous care that had kept him employed despite recessions and corporate restructuring and all the other forces that ground working men into poverty. At 5:15, every connection had been perfect. Now at 7:45, someone had deliberately loosened the audio feeds, had adjusted the relay settings to fail under high load, had sabotaged the system with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This was not equipment failure. This was not age or wear or unfortunate coincidence. Someone had come into this corridor after Graham's initial inspection and had methodically created the conditions for a catastrophic malfunction during the evening's most important event. Graham stood motionless before the open panel, his mind racing through possibilities. He should report this to Gerald Morrison. He should document the sabotage and let someone else deal with the consequences. This was not his problem, not his responsibility, not his world. But he thought about the woman with the expensive dress and the empty eyes leading her hungry daughter back to a table full of people who would never see either of them as anything other than chess pieces in some game Graham did not understand. He thought about Lily's laugh, how pure it had sounded, how unexpected, how precious. He thought about his own son, waiting in the break room, trusting that his father would keep them both safe in a world that offered no such guarantees. He began to repair the damage. His hands moved with the certainty of decades of experience, reconnecting wires, adjusting settings, documenting each change in the small notebook he carried everywhere. The saboteur had been skilled but not flawless, leaving traces that a careful observer could reconstruct. Graham photographed the evidence with his phone, uncertain what he would do with the images, but certain that someone should know what had happened. Wyatt appeared at his elbow, having grown bored with the break room or curious about his father's prolonged absence. Graham signed a brief explanation, his hands moving quickly through the vocabulary of their private language. Someone broke this on purpose. I am fixing it. Wyatt's eyes widened, and he signed back with the urgency of childhood conspiracy. Who would do that? Why, Graham had no answer, but as he worked, a memory surfaced unbidden. The silver-haired man at the head of the VIP table. Graham had seen him before years ago on a construction site in New Jersey where a similar electrical failure had nearly killed a worker. The investigation had blamed Graham's company, had cost men their jobs and their reputations, had ended careers with the casual cruelty of corporate liability management. Graham had always believed the failure was too convenient, too precisely timed, too perfectly positioned to be anything other than deliberate. He had seen that silver-haired man leaving the site the day before the accident. The memory was imperfect, degraded by time and trauma, and the deliberate effort Graham had made to move past that chapter of his life. He could not be certain the man at the VIP table was the same person he remembered from that awful week in New Jersey. but his instincts were screaming, and Graham Callahan had learned long ago that his instincts were worth trusting. He finished the repairs at 7:55, 5 minutes before the main course was scheduled to be served. The system would hold now would function as intended, would deliver whatever presentation or speech or entertainment the wealthy guests required for their Christmas Eve performance. Graham closed the panel and turned to find Wyatt watching him with the solemn attention of a child who understood that something important had happened. "We should tell someone," Wyatt signed. "We should," Graham agreed, "but not yet. First we watch. We pay attention. We see what happens next." The dinner had progressed through appetizers and soup and a sorbet palate cleanser by the time Victoria returned to the VIP table with Lily in tow. Douglas Harrington's expression registered something between amusement and concern as she reclaimed her seat, his silver eyebrows lifting in silent commentary. "Everything all right, Victoria? You seem to disappear rather suddenly." "My daughter needed a moment," Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the chaos still churning beneath her professional surface. "Children require attention even when business waits." The words came out sharper than she intended, carrying an edge of defiance that surprised her. Douglas's smile did not waver, but something shifted in his eyes, a recalculation of the woman he thought he understood. Richard Caldwell had watched her return with an expression Victoria could not read. His bourbon glass sat untouched beside his plate, his attention focused entirely on her face, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit together. When Victoria met his gaze, he did not look away. "The child," he said, "she has interesting taste in companions." Victoria followed his glance to where Lily had positioned Mr. Buttons on the table, the bear's button eyes reflecting the candlelight. "She carries him everywhere," Victoria heard herself say. "I do not actually know why." The admission cost her something, though she could not have explained exactly what. CEOs were supposed to know things, to have answers, to project the illusion of omniscience that made investors comfortable writing large checks. Admitting ignorance about her own daughter felt like a crack in the facade she had spent years constructing. Caldwell nodded slowly, his weathered face softening almost imperceptibly. "My daughter had a rabbit," he said, "carried it everywhere until she was 12. I used to think it was a phase she would outgrow. Turns out it was the one constant in a world that kept changing around her." Victoria did not know how to respond to this unexpected intimacy from a man she had prepared to approach purely as a business transaction. Before she could formulate a reply, the lights flickered. The murmur of conversation around the table stuttered, paused, resumed. The lights steadied. The background music continued its sophisticated interpretation of Christmas standards. But Victoria noticed the tension that rippled through the room, the servers exchanging glances, Gerald Morrison moving toward the kitchen with barely concealed urgency. Then the lights flickered again, longer this time, and the music stopped. The silence that followed was not the comfortable quiet of intimacy, but the charged stillness before a storm. Victoria felt Lily stiffen beside her daughter's hands moving to cover her ears in the protective gesture that preceded the auditory assault Victoria knew was coming. The feedback hit like a physical blow, a screech of electronic noise that erupted from the speakers and seemed to penetrate directly into the skull. Around the table, guests flinched and grimaced and covered their ears. But Lily's reaction was different, more extreme, the sound amplified by her hearing aids into something approaching torture. Victoria reached for her daughter without thinking, her hand finding Lily's shoulder as the child's face contorted in pain. She did not know what to do, did not know how to help, did not even know how to turn off the devices that were transforming sound into agony. And then he was there. Graham Callahan appeared beside the table, as if summoned by the force of Victoria's helplessness, his gray uniform incongruous among the evening gowns and designer suits. He knelt beside Lily with the fluid efficiency of someone who understood exactly what was happening, his hands moving in the sign language Victoria did not speak. Victoria watched frozen as the maintenance worker communicated with her daughter in the midst of chaos. His fingers formed shapes she could not interpret, but she could read. Lily's face could see the panic receding as understanding replaced confusion. Graham was explaining something, offering something, providing the lifeline Victoria did not know how to extend. Lily's hands came down from her ears, her breathing slowed. She focused on Graham's signing, the desperate attention of someone receiving emergency instructions in a language that finally made sense. The feedback stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The lights stabilized. The music resumed. Around the table, guests straightened their clothing and reached for water glasses and pretended nothing had happened the way people do when confronted with disruptions they cannot control. But Victoria could not pretend. She had watched a stranger do for her daughter what she should have been able to do herself. She had stood helpless while someone else provided the comfort and communication Lily needed in a moment of crisis. The realization burned in her chest with an intensity that surprised her. Graham rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. She is okay now. The system malfunctioned, but I fixed it. The sound should not happen again. Victoria opened her mouth to thank him, to apologize, to say something that would acknowledge the magnitude of what she had just witnessed. But Douglas Harrington spoke first. I believe our technical staff can handle any further issues. He did not bother to mask the dismissal in his voice. Thank you for your assistance. You may return to your duties. Graham's pale eyes moved to Douglas, and Victoria saw something flicker in their depths. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion. The maintenance worker did not respond immediately, and in that silence, Victoria felt the weight of unspoken histories pressing against the evening's polished surface. Lily's hand reached out and found Graham's, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused palm in a gesture of trust that made Victoria's throat tighten. Graham looked down at the child, then back at Douglas, and finally at Victoria. Whatever he was thinking remained behind the careful mask of a man who had learned that his thoughts were rarely welcome in rooms like this. She has courage, Graham said, his words addressed to Victoria, but carrying clearly enough for the entire table to hear. Your daughter, she does not give up easily. That is worth more than anything money can buy. He extracted his hand gently from Lily's grip, signed something Victoria could not follow, and turned to walk away. But as he passed behind Douglas Harrington's chair, Graham paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes fixed on the back of the older man's silver head, with an intensity that made Victoria's skin prickle. Then he was gone, disappearing into the corridors that separated the world of maintenance workers from the world of Christmas Eve dinners and billion-dollar deals. Victoria turned back to find Richard Caldwell watching her with an expression she could not decode. The investor raised his glass in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else entirely. Interesting evening, he said. I find I am curious to see what happens next. Victoria did not answer. She was looking at her daughter, at the small hand still extended toward the space where Graham Callahan had stood, at the expression on Lily's face that was somehow both loss and hope, in a question Victoria did not know how to answer. The dinner continued around them, conversation resuming its careful choreography, but Victoria Sterling remained suspended in a moment of recognition that would change everything that followed. She had spent 8 years building walls around her daughter's silence, constructing elaborate systems of professional intervention that allowed Victoria to feel like she was addressing the problem without ever actually entering the problem herself. She had hired translators instead of learning to translate. She had purchased technology instead of building connection. She had managed her daughter's disability like a corporate crisis, throwing resources at it while keeping her own hands clean. And in one chaotic moment, a maintenance worker had shown her exactly what all that management had failed to achieve. The rest of the evening stretched before Victoria like a test she had not studied for a presentation. She had not prepared a challenge she was no longer certain she knew how to meet. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself wanting to try. Something had broken open inside her, some wall or barrier, or carefully maintained separation between the executive and the mother. Victoria did not yet know what would grow in the space that opening created. She only knew that the woman who walked into the Gilded Oak that evening would not be the same woman who walked out. And in the corridor beyond the VIP section, Graham Callahan stood before the electrical panel he had already repaired, once looking at connections someone had altered in the brief window when the lights had flickered and everyone's attention had been fixed on the chaos in the dining room. The saboteur had struck again. This time the damage was more subtle, harder to detect, designed to fail not immediately but gradually to build toward a crisis that would peak at exactly the wrong moment. Graham studied the alterations with the growing certainty that whoever was responsible knew things about the evening's schedule that only an insider would know. Wyatt appeared at his elbow again, his young face creased with worry. Graham signed quickly, explaining what he had found, watching his son's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something that looked dangerously like anger. We have to tell someone, Wyatt insisted. We have to stop them. Graham considered the options. He could report to Gerald Morrison, but the manager would likely dismiss the concerns of a contract worker, especially one who had already caused disruption by allowing his child to wander into contact with VIP guests. He could try to find Victoria Sterling, but she had problems of her own and no reason to trust the word of a man she had met only minutes ago. He could call the police, but electrical sabotage was not the kind of crime that generated rapid response, and especially on Christmas Eve. Or he could fix it himself. Again. And watch. And wait for whoever was responsible to reveal themselves through action rather than accusation. Graham began the repairs, his hands moving with the steady precision of a man who understood that sometimes the only person you could count on was yourself. Behind him, Wyatt stood guard, watching the corridor for anyone who might approach a 10-year-old sentinel in a war neither of them fully understood. The Gilded Oak glittered with Christmas lights and expensive taste and the sophisticated conversation of people who believed their money made them important. But in the maintenance corridor, a different kind of work was being done, the unglamorous labor that kept the lights on and the music playing and the wealthy guests comfortable in their illusions. Graham Callahan did not know what the rest of the evening would bring. He only knew that someone in that VIP dining room was playing a game with stakes he could barely imagine, and that somewhere in the crossfire was a little girl in a red velvet dress who laughed like she had just discovered that joy was possible after all. He would not let them take that from her. The lights stayed on, the music played. The wealthy guests continued their dinner, unaware of the battles being fought in the spaces they never bothered to notice. And Victoria Sterling sat at the center of it all, her hand hovering inches from her daughter's shoulder, trying to remember how to bridge a distance she had spent 8 years creating. Victoria found herself rising from her chair before the decision had fully formed in her mind. The dinner conversation continued around her, Douglas holding court with an anecdote about market volatility that had the other board members nodding in calculated appreciation. But Victoria was no longer listening. Her attention had fixed on something more important than quarterly projections or investor confidence. Lily sat beside her, fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth, her eyes distant in the way they became when she retreated from a world that offered too much noise and not enough meaning. Mr. Button slumped against the girl's water glass, his button eyes reflecting the candlelight with an expression that seemed almost accusatory. Victoria leaned toward Richard Caldwell, her voice pitched below the general conversation. I need 10 minutes. There is something more important than this presentation that requires my attention. Caldwell's weathered face registered surprise, then something that might have been respect. The investor set down his fork with deliberate precision. 10 minutes is a small price for clarity. Take what you need. Douglas broke off his story mid-sentence, his silver eyebrows drawing together in an expression of polished concern. Victoria, surely whatever it is can wait until after we have concluded our business discussion. The investors have traveled considerable distances. Victoria met his gaze with the same steadiness she had deployed in 1,000 boardroom confrontations. My daughter has traveled 8 years without me bothering to learn her language. I think the investors can spare 10 minutes. The silence that followed her words spread across the table like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Margaret Whitmore's hand paused halfway to her wineglass. Robert Crane stopped checking his phone. Even Meredith Walsh, who had materialized at Victoria's elbow with the timing of a practiced handler, seemed momentarily frozen by the unprecedented sight of Victoria Sterling prioritizing anything over business. Victoria did not wait for permission or approval. She touched Lily's shoulder gently this time and gestured toward the far corner of the restaurant where a small table sat empty near the windows overlooking Madison Avenue. Lily looked up at her mother with an expression of wary confusion, as if uncertain whether this attention represented opportunity or threat. Come with me. Victoria kept her voice soft, though she knew the volume did not matter. She supplemented the words with a gesture toward the empty table, hoping the meaning would translate across the barrier she had spent 8 years refusing to cross. There is someone I want us to talk to. The walk across the restaurant felt longer than the physical distance warranted, each step carrying Victoria further from the professional identity she had constructed and closer to a version of herself she did not yet recognize. She could feel Douglas's gaze burning into her back, could sense the recalculations happening around the VIP table as witnesses processed the implications of her departure. None of it mattered as much as the small hand that had found its way into hers, Lily's fingers curling around Victoria's palm with tentative pressure that communicated more than any quarterly report ever had. Graham Callahan stood near the service corridor, conferring quietly with his son about something that had drawn matching furrows of concern across both their foreheads. Victoria approached with a directness that surprised her, cutting through the usual protocols of class and station that governed interactions between executives and maintenance workers. Mr. Callahan. The formality felt strange on her tongue, inadequate for addressing a man who had shown her daughter more understanding in 15 minutes than Victoria had managed in 8 years. I have a request, an unusual one. Graham turned to face her, his pale eyes assessing the situation with the quick intelligence of someone accustomed to reading circumstances that could shift without warning. His son moved slightly closer, a protective instinct that mirrored Lily's own tendency to seek shelter when confronted with uncertainty. Victoria gestured toward the empty table by the windows. I would like you and your son to sit with us, just for a few minutes. I want to understand how you communicate with my daughter. The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that extended far beyond a simple conversation. Graham glanced toward the VIP section, where Douglas Harrington had risen from his seat and was watching their exchange with an expression of thinly veiled displeasure. I am supposed to be working, Graham said, though his tone suggested the objection was procedural rather than personal. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of constraints she had not realized she was maintaining. Consider this part of your work. Customer service if you need a category. I am a customer and I am asking for your service. Wyatt tugged at his father's sleeve, his young face bright with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a child who had found an unexpected friend. Dad, Lily wants to show me something. She was telling me about her school before everything got crazy. Please, the boy's appeal accomplished what Victoria's executive authority could not. Graham's expression softened, the professional mask giving way to something more recognizably human. He nodded once a decision made and allowed his son to lead them toward the table where Lily had already claimed a chair facing the window. The four of them settled into seats arranged around the small table, an unlikely assembly that drew curious glances from nearby diners. Victoria found herself positioned across from Graham, their children between them like bridges, spanning a divide neither adult had expected to cross. Wyatt began signing immediately, his hands moving with the fluid confidence of someone communicating in a language as natural as breathing. Lily responded in kind, her fingers dancing through shapes that held meaning Victoria could not access. The two children fell into conversation with the ease of old friends, reunited, their exchange punctuated by grins and eye rolls, and the universal body language of children sharing secrets. Victoria watched her daughter's face transform, the careful blankness replaced by animation and engagement and something that looked dangerously like joy. She had seen glimpses of this Lily before in the corridor outside the maintenance closet, but here in the full light of the restaurant, the change was even more striking. She is telling him about her teacher Graham, translated his voice low enough that only Victoria could hear. Apparently the woman uses too much finger spelling and not enough actual signs. Your daughter finds it frustrating. Victoria absorbed this information with the slightly dazed sensation of discovering an entirely new dimension to someone she had thought she knew. Lily had opinions about teaching methods. Lily had frustrations she wanted to share. Lily had an inner life that extended far beyond the careful compliance she displayed for her mother's benefit. How did you learn? Victoria heard herself ask. Sign language. Was it for him? She indicated Wyatt with a subtle gesture. Graham's expression shifted, shadows passing across his features like clouds across a winter sun. The story came in measured phrases, each word carrying the weight of memories that still had the power to wound. 5 years ago, Wyatt fell from a playground structure, hit his head on the equipment base. The trauma caused swelling that compressed his auditory nerves. The doctors were not sure if the damage would be permanent. Victoria felt her breath catch her mind, automatically translating the clinical description into the terror it must have represented for a father facing the sudden silence of his only child. For 8 months, Graham continued, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the restaurant's elegant windows. Wyatt could not hear anything. Not my voice, not music, not the sound of cars or birds or his own footsteps. He was trapped in a world without sound, and I could not reach him. The parallel to Lily's experience pressed against Victoria's consciousness with uncomfortable weight. But you learned. You found a way to communicate. Graham's hands moved in an unconscious gesture, fingers forming shapes that had become part of his native vocabulary. I had no choice. He was my son, and he was disappearing into the silence, and I would have learned to speak in tongues if that was what it took to reach him. The conviction in his voice illuminated something Victoria had been avoiding for 8 years. Graham had faced a similar challenge and had responded by transforming himself by learning an entirely new language, by meeting his child in the space where his child actually lived. Victoria had responded by hiring professionals to do the transforming for her. The children's conversation had shifted Wyatt, now demonstrating something that required elaborate hand movements and facial expressions. Lily attempted to copy him, failed, laughed at her own clumsiness, and tried again. The sound of her laughter reached Victoria like a message from a country she had never visited. "Teach me something," Victoria said, the words emerging before she could second-guess them. "One thing, something I can say to her." Graham studied her face for a moment, reading something in her expression that seemed to satisfy whatever test he had been applying. He raised his hands, positioning them in front of his chest. "Home," he said, forming his fingers into a shape like a peaked roof. "This is the sign for home." Victoria copied the gesture, her hands awkward and uncertain in their new configuration. Graham corrected her finger placement with patient precision, adjusting angles until the sign matched some standards she could not perceive. "Now family." His hands moved again, fingers interweaving in a pattern that suggested connection and belonging. "You make a circle with both hands, like you are gathering people together." Victoria repeated the motion, feeling clumsy and exposed in a way that executive presentations never made her feel. The vulnerability of learning something new, of being a beginner in front of someone who had already mastered the territory, pressed against her carefully maintained armor. "One more," Graham said, "the most important one." He placed his hand flat against his chest over his heart, then moved it outward toward where Lily sat. "Love. You touch your heart, then direct the sign toward the person you love." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she performed the gesture, her palm pressing against silk that cost more than most people's monthly rent, then extending toward the daughter she had failed to reach for so many years. The simplicity of the motion contained a complexity she was only beginning to understand. Across the table, Lily had stopped signing with Wyatt. Her daughter was watching Victoria with an expression of such raw hope that it made Victoria's throat constrict around emotions she had trained herself never to display in public. "She does not expect you to be perfect." Graham said, his voice soft with understanding that cut through Victoria's defenses like a blade. "She just needs to know you are trying." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, to thank him, to articulate some fraction of the gratitude and shame and determination that were churning through her carefully ordered mind. But before she could speak, a hand descended onto her shoulder with the possessive weight of an anchor. "Victoria." Douglas Harrington's voice carried the pleasant menace of a threat disguised as concern. "We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. The presentation materials appear to have been misplaced." Victoria turned to find the silver-haired board member standing over her, his expression arranged in an approximation of helpfulness that did not extend to his eyes. Behind him, Gerald Morrison hovered with the anxious demeanor of a man whose evening had veered catastrophically off script. "The USB drive containing your financial projections," Gerald explained, his voice pitched low to avoid attracting attention from nearby tables. "It seems to have vanished from the presentation case. We have searched the VIP area thoroughly." Victoria felt the familiar machinery of crisis response activating in her mind, the professional protocols that had guided her through 100 corporate emergencies. But something was different now. Some fundamental reordering of priorities that made her resistant to the automatic response Douglas clearly expected. "When was it last confirmed present?" Gerald's face tightened with the discomfort of admitting failure. "The case was checked at 7:45 immediately before the first course was served. The drive was in its designated slot. When we prepared for the presentation 15 minutes ago, the slot was empty." Victoria calculated the timeline automatically. The window of opportunity encompassed the electrical malfunction, her departure, to find Lily, the 10 minutes she had just spent at this table. Anyone with access to the VIP area could have taken the drive during any of those intervals. Douglas leaned closer, his voice dropping to a register intended to convey confidential concern. "This is obviously a sensitive matter. We should discuss it privately rather than broadcasting our difficulties to the entire restaurant." But his eyes moved to Graham as he spoke, and Victoria felt the implication land like a physical blow. The maintenance worker had been in the VIP area during the electrical failure. The maintenance worker had access to the technical equipment. The maintenance worker was the obvious suspect for anyone looking to deflect attention from less visible culprits. Meredith Walsh materialized beside Douglas with the synchronicity of a practiced partnership. Perhaps security should review who has been moving through the service areas this evening. She directed a significant glance toward Graham, particularly any temporary staff with unusual access patterns. Victoria watched the accusation form in the air between them, saw the way Graham's expression closed into the careful blankness of a man who had learned that defending himself against people like Douglas Harrington rarely produced favorable outcomes. "You think Mr. Callahan took the USB drive," Victoria said flatly. "Based on what evidence exactly?" "He has been in and out of restricted areas all evening," Douglas replied with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to having his assumptions accepted as fact. "His child has been wandering unsupervised. And frankly, Victoria, his sudden familiarity with your daughter raises questions about his motivations." The words hit Victoria like a slap, the ugliness of the implication laying bare the kind of thinking that Douglas employed when he believed himself unobserved. A working man showing kindness to a disabled child became in Douglas's framework a suspect pursuing some undefined agenda. Dad did not take anything. Wyatt's voice cut through the adult conversation with the indignant clarity of a child confronting injustice. He was fixing the electrical stuff that someone broke. He was helping people. Douglas's smile did not waver, but his eyes hardened as he regarded the boy. "I am sure your father is a fine man, but this is a matter for adults to resolve. Perhaps you should wait in the staff area while we sort things out." Graham placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of restraint and reassurance that communicated more than words could convey. His pale eyes met Douglas's with the quiet dignity of a man who had survived worse than accusations from silver-haired executives in expensive suits. "If security wants to search my belongings, they are welcome to do so. I have nothing to hide." "Excellent," Douglas said, the word carrying satisfaction that made Victoria's skin prickle with warning. "Gerald, please ask Mr. Lawson to join us. I believe a thorough search is in order." The next several minutes unfolded with the horrible inevitability of a nightmare. Victoria could not stop. Derek Lawson, the restaurant's head of security, approached with the professional demeanor of a man who had conducted many such searches and derived no pleasure from any of them. Guests at nearby tables began to notice the commotion, conversations faltering as attention shifted toward the tableau of wealth and power confronting a man in a maintenance uniform. Graham stood still while Derek examined his tool bag, each item removed and inspected before being placed on the table that had witnessed such different interactions only minutes before. Screwdrivers, wire strippers, electrical tape, a voltage meter, the tools of his trade now displayed like evidence in a prosecution he had not consented to face. Wyatt stood beside his father, tears streaming down his face in silent testament to the injustice he was witnessing. The boy's hands moved in agitated signs that Victoria could not read but could interpret from context. He was defending his father, protesting the treatment, demanding that someone recognize the wrongness of what was happening. And Victoria stood frozen, caught between the professional instincts that urged her to distance herself from controversy and the new awareness that had been growing since she first heard Lily laugh in that fluorescent-lit corridor. Douglas watched the search with the barely concealed satisfaction of a chess player whose gambit was proceeding exactly as planned. Around them, the VIP guests had abandoned any pretense of disinterest, their attention fixed on the spectacle of a working man being humiliated before an audience of his social betters. The search concluded without producing any USB drive. Derek Lawson stepped back with an expression that conveyed both relief and discomfort, his professional obligation fulfilled, but his personal assessment clearly aligned against the accusation that had prompted the procedure. Douglas's expression flickered with momentary frustration before resetting to its default configuration of concerned authority. The drive must be somewhere. Perhaps a more thorough examination of Mr. Callahan's person would be appropriate. Victoria felt something snap inside her, some final restraint that had been holding back the flood of recognition that had been building since she first watched Graham communicate with her daughter. "No." The word emerged with a force that surprised her, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. Douglas turned toward her with the expression of a man who has miscalculated an opponent's position. Victoria, surely you understand the need for thorough investigation. The drive contains sensitive financial information. Victoria stepped forward, positioning herself between Graham and the assembly of executives and security personnel who had gathered to witness his humiliation. Her voice carried with the clarity of someone who has finally decided to stop pretending. This man saved our presentation tonight. He repaired electrical sabotage that would have destroyed this entire event. His reward for that service should not be public degradation based on nothing more than the convenience of his presence. Douglas's smile tightened around its edges. Sabotage is a serious accusation, Victoria. Do you have evidence to support such a claim? Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her, the comfortable certainties of corporate politics giving way to something more treacherous and more honest. She did not have evidence, not the kind that would satisfy a board investigation or stand up in a legal proceeding. But she had 8 years of watching Douglas Harrington operate, 8 years of noting the convenient failures that always seemed to benefit his position, 8 years of sensing the predator behind the gentleman's facade. Before she could respond, movement at the periphery of her vision drew her attention. Lily had risen from her chair at the small table by the window and was walking toward the cluster of adults with a determination that transformed her usual tentative posture into something approaching defiance. Victoria's daughter stopped at the edge of the group, her small form dwarfed by the executives and security personnel who towered over her. Mr. Buttons dangled from one hand, forgotten in the urgency of whatever message Lily had decided to deliver. And then Lily began to sign. Her hands moved with a precision that Victoria had never witnessed, each gesture deliberate and clear, her face animated with the intensity of someone who had been silent too long and would not be silenced any longer. The movements meant nothing to most of the observers, a mysterious choreography that prompted confused glances and shifted stances. But Graham understood. She says the man with the gray hair went into the electrical room before her father arrived. Graham translated, his voice carrying the weight of testimony he was merely relaying. She saw him from the hallway where she was waiting. He was looking at something touching wires, and then he left quickly when he heard someone coming. Douglas's complexion shifted from its usual ruddy confidence towards something paler and less controlled. The child is confused. I was nowhere near the electrical systems this evening. Lily's hands moved again more emphatically, her expression fierce with the determination of someone who knows they are telling the truth and will not be dismissed. She says it was definitely him. Graham continued. The silver hair, the expensive suit, the ring with the blue stone. She noticed because he seemed angry when he left the room. Victoria's eyes dropped automatically to Douglas's right hand, where a sapphire ring glinted in the candlelight. The ring she had seen him wear at every board meeting, every corporate function, every public appearance for the past 18 months. The coincidence was too specific to be invented, too detailed to be the confusion of a child's unreliable memory. Children see things adults learn to overlook. Victoria heard herself say, her voice carrying a new quality she did not immediately recognize. Perhaps because no one bothers to explain to them what they are supposed to ignore. Douglas's recovery was swift, the polish of decades in corporate combat reasserting itself over the momentary crack in his composure. This is absurd. You cannot seriously be crediting the accusations of a child who cannot even speak properly against a member of your own board. The words landed like a blow across Victoria's face. The casual cruelty of that phrase, cannot even speak properly, illuminating everything Douglas truly thought about her daughter and everyone like her. Victoria felt something crystallize inside her, some transformation that had been building throughout this impossible evening. She turned to face Douglas fully, her posture shifting from defensive to confrontational in a way that drew a sharp intake of breath from Meredith Walsh. My daughter speaks perfectly well. The fact that you never bothered to learn her language does not make her silent. It makes you deaf. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of war that could not be retracted. Douglas's expression hardened into something that no longer bothered to pretend at cordiality. Victoria, you are making a serious mistake. The board will not look favorably on a CEO who cannot maintain objectivity in a crisis. Victoria felt a laugh building in her chest, bitter and liberating, and entirely inappropriate for the circumstances. Objectivity. Is that what you call it when you sabotage electrical systems and steal USB drives and try to frame innocent men for your crimes? Derek Lawson shifted uncomfortably at the periphery of the confrontation. his professional instincts clearly urging him toward intervention, but his authority uncertain in the face of an executive-level conflict. Richard Caldwell's voice cut through the tension with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard regardless of volume. I believe there is a simple way to resolve this dispute. The restaurant has security cameras. If Mr. Harrington did not enter the electrical room this evening, the footage will confirm his account. If he did well, he let the implication complete itself. Douglas's reaction was slight but revealing a momentary tightening around the eyes that suggested the cameras had not factored into his calculations. Gerald, I hardly think it is necessary to involve surveillance footage in what is clearly a misunderstanding. Gerald Morrison looked between the board member and the investor, his career survival instincts working visibly behind his eyes. Actually, Mr. Harrington, our insurance requires us to review footage whenever theft allegations arise. I am afraid the protocol is quite specific. Victoria seized the opening before Douglas could manufacture another objection. Show us the footage. From the service corridor where the electrical panels are located, the timestamp should tell us exactly who was where throughout the evening. The next 15 minutes passed with the excruciating slowness of a verdict being delivered. Gerald produced a tablet connected to the restaurant's security system, accessing archive footage with the resigned efficiency of a man who understood that this evening had already exceeded the boundaries of manageable difficulty. The VIP guests gathered around the small screen, their earlier dinner conversation abandoned, in favor of a drama far more compelling than any they had anticipated. Victoria found herself positioned beside Richard Caldwell, whose weathered face betrayed nothing of his assessment of the unfolding situation. The footage began at 6 o'clock, showing the service corridor in the flat illumination of security cameras. Graham Callahan appeared at 5:15, his inspection of the electrical panel documented in timestamp detail. He worked methodically, checking connections and noting readings before closing the panel and moving out of frame. The corridor remained empty until 6:10, when a different figure entered from the direction of the main restaurant. The silver hair and expensive suit were unmistakable, even in the grainy footage. Douglas Harrington. Victoria watched as the board member approached the electrical panel, looked over his shoulder with the furtive awareness of someone who knew they were doing something they should not be doing, and opened the access door. His hands moved inside the panel for nearly 2 minutes before he stepped back, closed the door, and departed with a pace that suggested someone eager to avoid observation. 5 minutes later, another figure appeared. A young man in a server's uniform, his face partially visible as he approached the same panel. Unlike Douglas, this man displayed no hesitation opening the access door with the confidence of someone following clear instructions. His modifications took less than a minute before he too departed the frame. The timestamp showed 6:20 when the corridor finally returned to its empty state. No one spoke as Gerald scrolled forward through the footage, advancing to the period after the electrical malfunction when Graham had performed his emergency repairs. The maintenance worker appeared at 7:50, his expression shifting from professional concentration to visible alarm as he examined what the camera could not show, but what everyone now understood: the sabotage that had nearly destroyed the evening's most important event. Richard Caldwell broke the silence with a single word: illuminating. Douglas Harrington stood rigid at the edge of the group, his face a mask that revealed nothing and therefore revealed everything. The evidence on the screen left no room for alternative interpretation, no space for the reasonable doubt that expensive lawyers might have manufactured in a courtroom setting. The server in the footage, Gerald said carefully, matches a temporary hire we brought on for tonight's event. His name is listed as James Blackwood, but the agency has no record of anyone by that name on their roster. A phantom employee, Victoria said, the pieces connecting in her mind with the clarity of a puzzle finally revealing its pattern. Someone hired specifically for tonight. Someone who knew exactly when and where to cause maximum damage. Douglas remained silent, his legal training apparently asserting itself over any impulse towards self-defense. But his silence was its own kind of confession, an acknowledgement that the elaborate narrative he had constructed was collapsing under the weight of documentary evidence. Meredith Walsh stepped forward, her platinum hair catching the light as she positioned herself at the edge of the group. Her expression had shifted during the footage review, the practiced loyalty giving way to something more calculating and self-preserving. I can provide additional context, Meredith said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone making a strategic decision. Mr. Harrington approached me 6 weeks ago with a proposal. He wanted me to ensure that tonight's event experienced certain difficulties. Image problems, he called them. Nothing that would cause permanent damage, just enough disruption to raise questions about Mrs. Sterling's leadership. Douglas turned toward her with an expression of betrayed fury. Meredith, I would advise you to consider carefully before making accusations you cannot support. Meredith's smile held no warmth. I have emails, Douglas. I have text messages. I have the payment records from the offshore account you used to compensate me for my cooperation. I was willing to play along when it seemed like you would succeed, but I am not willing to go down with you now that you have failed. The revelation rippled through the gathered witnesses, transforming understanding of everything that had preceded it. Douglas Harrington had not acted alone. He had built a network of accomplices, had methodically constructed the conditions for Victoria's public failure, had weaponized her daughter's disability as part of his strategy for corporate conquest. Victoria felt the anger rising in her chest, hot and righteous and entirely justified. But beneath the anger lay something else, something more complicated and more lasting. She had spent 8 years building walls between herself and her daughter, convinced that professional success would somehow compensate for personal absence. Douglas had seen that distance and had calculated correctly that it represented vulnerability he could exploit. He had been right about the vulnerability. He had been wrong about Victoria's response. Gerald, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Please ensure that Mr. Harrington's access to all Sterling Technologies systems is terminated immediately. Jonathan, she turned to her attorney who had watched the evening's developments with the alert attention of a lawyer sensing imminent litigation. I want a full investigation launched by morning. Every email, every financial transaction, every communication that passed through company channels. Jonathan Hayes nodded with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this moment. I will have preliminary findings on your desk by noon tomorrow. Douglas made a final attempt at recovery, his voice carrying the wounded dignity of a man who still believed his position entitled him to consideration. Victoria, you are overreacting. Whatever disagreements we may have had about strategy, I have always acted in the company's best interests. Victoria turned to face him fully, and in that moment she saw not the polished board member, but the predator who had been stalking her for 18 months, who had plotted to destroy her career while smiling at her across conference tables, who had looked at her daughter and seen only a weakness to be exploited. You looked at my child and saw a liability, Victoria said, her words carrying to every corner of the silent restaurant. You calculated that my love for her made me vulnerable, that my absence from her life proved I could not be trusted to lead. But you miscalculated, Douglas. You thought my distance from Lily meant I did not care. The truth is that I cared so much I was afraid to get close enough to fail her. The confession emerged without planning, a truth Victoria had been avoiding for years, finally finding its voice. Around her, the gathered witnesses absorbed the admission with varying degrees of understanding, but Victoria's attention had fixed on a single face. Lily stood at the edge of the group, Mr. Buttons clutched against her chest, her brown eyes wide with an expression Victoria had never seen directed at her before. Not the careful blankness of managed expectations, not the wary distance of a child who had learned not to hope for too much. Something new, something that looked dangerously like recognition. Graham translated Victoria's words into sign language, his hands moving with the gentle precision of someone who understood the importance of what was being communicated. Lily watched his signing, then turned back to her mother with a question forming on her features. Victoria knelt on the restaurant's expensive carpet, bringing herself to her daughter's eye level for what felt like the first time in years. She did not know enough signs to say what she needed to say, but she tried anyway, her hands forming the shapes Graham had taught her only minutes before. Home, family, love. The signs were clumsy, probably incorrect in ways that would make a fluent signer wince. But Lily was not a critic evaluating technique. Lily was a child seeing her mother try, perhaps for the first time, to meet her in the space where she actually lived. Lily's response came not in signs, but in action. She stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around Victoria's neck. Mr. Buttons pressed between them like a witness to a miracle neither of them had expected. At the periphery of the embrace, Margaret Whitmore made a sound that drew Victoria's attention. The elderly investor had tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, her composure shattered by something the scene had triggered. "Forgive me, Margaret," said her voice carrying the tremor of emotions long suppressed. "Your daughter reminded me of someone. My granddaughter. She is 15 now, autistic, brilliant in ways that terrify her as parents. They keep her hidden when company visits as if she is something to be ashamed of. Victoria rose slowly, Lily's hand finding hers with a naturalness that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. She recognized the pain in Margaret's voice, the particular anguish of watching someone you love be treated as a problem rather than a person. Margaret continued, her words gaining strength as she spoke. I have spent decades building a career in a world that has no patience for difference. I convinced myself that hiding was protection, that invisibility was safety. But watching your daughter stand up in front of all these people and tell the truth despite everything that should have silenced her, I realized something. The older woman's gaze moved to Lily, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to follow a conversation she could not hear. The children we try to protect by hiding them, Margaret said often, turn out to be braver than the adults who think they are doing the protecting. Victoria felt the truth of those words resonating with everything she had witnessed this evening. Lily had stood up when the adults around her had been paralyzed by calculation and self-interest. Lily had told the truth when everyone else had been busy protecting their positions. Lily had shown more courage in her 8 years than Victoria had demonstrated in a career built on strategic caution. Thank you, Victoria said to Margaret, and found that she meant it for more than just the kind words. Thank you for seeing her. Margaret nodded, then turned to address the gathered witnesses with the authority of someone who had built her reputation on decisive action. I believe we have seen enough to draw conclusions about tonight's events. Mr. Harrington's behavior is disqualifying at every level. I move that we proceed with the business discussion we came here to conduct, with the understanding that certain voices at the table no longer warrant consideration. Richard Caldwell seconded the motion with a slight inclination of his head. Douglas Harrington stood isolated at the edge of the group, his allies having melted away with the speed that characterized corporate relationships when liability became contagious. Derek Lawson stepped forward with the professional demeanor of a man who had been waiting for clear direction. Mr. Harrington, I believe it would be best if you departed the premises. I can have your coat retrieved from the check room. The security chief's tone brooked no argument, and Douglas, for all his corporate combat experience, recognized when a position had become untenable. He straightened his jacket with the reflexive attention to appearance that had served him well for decades, but the gesture could not disguise the magnitude of his defeat. This is not over, Victoria, Douglas said as he turned to leave. You have made enemies tonight that you cannot afford. Victoria watched him go with an expression that held neither triumph nor fear. Perhaps, but I have also discovered allies I did not know I had, including the one I should have recognized 8 years ago. Her hand tightened around Lily's, and she felt an answering pressure that communicated more than any corporate victory ever had. The evening's business resumed with a different tenor than anyone had anticipated. Victoria delivered her presentation from memory, the stolen USB drive having become irrelevant in the face of the character demonstration that had preceded it. Richard Caldwell asked probing questions that revealed the depth of his interest, while Margaret Whitmore contributed observations that suggested her engagement extended beyond mere financial calculation. But Victoria's attention kept drifting to the small table by the window, where Graham and Wyatt had resumed their seats, patiently waiting for the adults to conclude whatever business required such elaborate rituals. Lily had asked through signs that Graham translated if she could sit with them while her mother worked. Victoria had agreed without hesitation, and the sight of her daughter laughing with her new friends but provided a counterpoint to the serious discussions happening at the VIP table. Jonathan Hayes positioned himself near Victoria during a break in the negotiations, his expression thoughtful. You know Douglas will not accept defeat quietly. He has too much invested in seeing you fail. Victoria nodded, her eyes still fixed on Lily's animated conversation with Wyatt. I know, but I have spent too long being afraid of what people like Douglas might do if I stopped playing by their rules. Tonight showed me that the rules were never designed to protect me in the first place. Jonathan followed her gaze to the children's table. Your daughter made quite an impression. Several of the investors have asked about her. Victoria felt something warm spreading through her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that she eventually identified as pride. Not pride in accomplishment, the kind she felt when quarterly numbers exceeded projections or market share expanded into new territories. This was something different. Pride in a person. Pride in Lily, who had found her voice in a room full of people who had spent their lives talking over everyone else. She is remarkable, Victoria said, and realized she was only beginning to understand how remarkable. She has been remarkable all along. I was just too busy managing her to notice. The negotiations concluded shortly before 11, with handshakes and preliminary agreements, and the kind of cautious optimism that characterized the early stages of potentially transformative partnerships. Richard Caldwell departed with a final glance toward the children's table and a slight smile that suggested his assessment of Victoria Sterling had evolved considerably over the course of the evening. Margaret Whitmore lingered after the other investors had gone, approaching Victoria with a directness that cut through the usual post-meeting pleasantries. "I want to tell you something," Margaret said, her voice carrying an intimacy that belied their brief acquaintance. "I have watched many executives over the years, men and women, who claimed to have principles they would not compromise. Most of them, when the moment came to choose between their principles and their positions, discovered that their principles were more flexible than they had believed." Victoria waited, sensing that Margaret was building towards something important. "Tonight you chose your daughter over your company," Margaret continued. "You chose truth over convenience. You chose the opinion of a maintenance worker over the opinion of your own board member. Those choices cost you something, and you made them anyway. That is the kind of person I want to invest in." The words carried weight that transcended their immediate context. Victoria understood that Margaret was offering more than financial backing, more than professional endorsement. She was offering the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who had navigated similar waters and understood the price of the choices Victoria had made. "Thank you," Victoria said. "That means more than you know." Margaret nodded, then glanced toward the children's table, where Lily was teaching Wyatt the sign for something that made both of them dissolve into giggles. "Learn the language," Margaret said. "Not because it will make you a better CEO, because it will make you a better mother. And in the end, that is the only title that matters." The older woman departed with the quiet dignity of someone who had said what she came to say and felt no need to elaborate. Victoria stood alone for a moment in the emptying restaurant, processing an evening that had transformed her understanding of everything she thought she valued. The Gilded Oak had grown quiet around her, the Christmas Eve crowd thinning as guests departed for midnight services and family gatherings and the private celebrations that marked the holiday. Staff moved through the dining room with efficient purpose, clearing tables and dimming lights, restoring the space to its waiting state. Victoria walked toward the table by the window, where her daughter sat with strangers who had become something more than strangers over the course of an impossible evening. Graham Callahan rose as she approached his posture, carrying the respectful formality of someone uncertain how the boundaries between them had shifted. "It has been an unusual night," Graham said, the understatement carrying a weight of shared experience that required no elaboration. Victoria looked at the man who had shown her daughter kindness without calculation, who had taught Victoria more about communication in a few minutes than she had learned in 8 years of managing specialists. "I want to hire you," she said, the words emerging with a directness that surprised her. "My company needs someone who understands accessibility, who can help us design spaces and systems that work for people like Lily. I want that person to be you." Graham's expression shifted through surprise into something more complex, an assessment of options and implications that suggested he was not a man who made decisions impulsively. "I have a job," he said carefully, "and a son who needs stability more than opportunity." Victoria glanced at Wyatt, who had positioned himself protectively beside Lily as the adult conversation unfolded. "I am not asking you to abandon anything you have built. I am asking you to build something new alongside what already exists. Part-time, flexible hours, whatever schedule works for you and Wyatt. I just know that my daughter trusts you in a way she does not trust most people, and I have learned tonight that her judgment is considerably better than mine." Graham looked at his son, some silent communication passing between them that Victoria could not interpret. Then he turned back to her with an expression that had resolved into decision. "I will think about it," he said. "That is not a no. It is an honest assessment that decisions like this deserve more consideration than a Christmas Eve conversation can provide." Victoria accepted the response with a nod that conveyed respect for his process. "Thinking is all I ask. And Graham, thank you for everything you did tonight, for Lily and for me." Graham's pale eyes held hers for a moment, and in that connection, Victoria sensed the possibility of something she had not anticipated when she walked into the restaurant hours earlier. Not romance, not in any conventional sense, but partnership, collaboration. The kind of relationship that emerged when two people recognized in each other the qualities they most needed to develop in themselves. The taxi carried Victoria and Lily through Manhattan streets, transformed by fresh snow into something approaching the Christmas card images Victoria had stopped noticing years ago. The city glittered outside the windows, a million lights reflecting off white surfaces, and for the first time in longer than Victoria could remember, she found herself appreciating the beauty rather than calculating the traffic implications. Lily sat beside her, Mr. Buttons restored to his position of honor against her chest. The girl's face was pressed to the window, watching the snow with an expression of wonder that made Victoria's heart ache with recognition of everything she had missed. Victoria touched her daughter's shoulder gently, waiting for Lily to turn before attempting the signs Graham had taught her. Home, family, love. The gestures were still clumsy, still probably incorrect in ways a native signer would immediately identify. But Lily did not seem to notice the imperfections. Her face broke into a smile that illuminated the dark interior of the taxi like sunrise after a long night. Lily signed something back, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone speaking her native language. Victoria did not understand the words, but she understood the emotion behind them. Her daughter was talking to her, really talking, and Victoria was finally ready to listen. The taxi pulled to a stop outside Victoria's building, and mother and daughter emerged into the cold clarity of Christmas Eve transformed into Christmas morning. Snow continued to fall around them, gentle and persistent, covering the city in white silence that felt for once not like an absence but like a presence. Victoria looked up at the building she had purchased with the first major profits from her company, the penthouse that represented everything she had sacrificed her personal life to achieve. The windows were dark, waiting for their return, offering shelter and warmth. But not Victoria realized home. Home was not a place. Home was the hand she held as they walked through the lobby. Home was the child who had forgiven her before Victoria had even finished asking for forgiveness. Home was the language she had just begun to learn, the bridge she had just begun to build, the relationship she had just begun to repair. Tomorrow, there were to be consequences to manage legal proceedings, to initiate corporate structures, to reorganize in the wake of Douglas Harrington's exposure. Tomorrow, the work of rebuilding what she had neglected would truly begin, the slow and painstaking process of learning to communicate with a daughter who had been waiting 8 years for her mother to pay attention. But tonight, on this transformed Christmas Eve, Victoria Sterling walked into her building with her daughter's hand in hers and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The elevator rose through the building in silence, mother and daughter standing close together in the small space. Lily looked up at Victoria with an expression that contained multitudes of questions and hopes and possibilities that Victoria was only beginning to learn how to read. Victoria signed home again, the gesture that Graham had taught her, and Lily's smile was all the response she needed. They had a long way to go, but they had finally, after 8 years of parallel existence, begun to travel the same road. The penthouse was silent when Victoria woke on Christmas morning, the kind of silence that had once felt comfortable and now registered as absence. She lay in bed watching the gray light seep through curtains she had never bothered to replace, aware of a fundamental shift in how she perceived the space she had called home for 7 years. Her phone showed 17 missed calls, a constellation of contacts ranging from board members to journalists to numbers she did not recognize. The news of Douglas Harrington's exposure had spread with the velocity that only scandal could generate, transforming Christmas morning into a crisis management exercise that would have consumed every hour of Victoria's attention in any previous year. Instead, she silenced the phone and walked down the hallway to Lily's room. Her daughter slept with Mr. Buttons tucked beneath her chin, the worn teddy bear's button eyes catching the dim light from the window. Victoria stood in the doorway watching the rise and fall of Lily's breathing, counting the seconds between each inhalation with the attention she had previously reserved for quarterly reports and merger documents. 8 years. The number carried a weight Victoria was only beginning to fully comprehend. 8 years of morning routines conducted in parallel rather than together. 8 years of delegated bedtimes and outsourced conversations. 8 years of telling herself that providing for Lily was the same as being present for her. Victoria crossed the room, quietly settling into the chair beside Lily's bed, where countless nannies and night nurses had spent their professional hours. The position felt unfamiliar. The perspective revealing details she had never noticed, the drawings taped to the wall, Depicting figures Victoria could not identify, the books stacked on the nightstand with titles in both English and ASL notation. The photographs arranged on the dresser showing Lily at various ages with people Victoria did not recognize. She had missed so much. The realization settled into her bones with the permanence of a diagnosis that could not be wished away. Lily stirred her eyes, opening with the gradual awareness of someone emerging from dreams. When she saw her mother sitting beside the bed, her expression shifted through surprise into something more cautious, the learned wariness of a child who had been disappointed too many times to trust easily. Victoria raised her hand and formed the sign Graham had taught her. Home. Lily watched her mother's clumsy gesture with an expression that evolved from confusion to recognition to something Victoria could not immediately identify. Then her daughter sat up in bed, Mr. Buttons still clutched against her chest, and signed something back with the fluency Victoria envied and was determined to acquire. Victoria shook her head slightly, the admission of incomprehension, carrying a vulnerability she was learning to accept. I do not understand, she said aloud, supplementing the words with a gesture she hoped conveyed her meaning. Show me again. Slower. Lily's eyes widened at the request. She repeated the sign with exaggerated precision, her small fingers forming shapes that Victoria studied with the concentration she had previously applied to financial models and strategic analyses. Breakfast, Victoria guessed, recognizing the motion toward the mouth. Lily shook her head and repeated the sign, this time pointing at herself, then at Victoria, then bringing her hands together. Together, Victoria said the word landing with a weight that transcended its simple meaning. You want us to do something together. Lily's smile broke across her face like dawn after a long night. She nodded vigorously, then scrambled out of bed with the energy of a child who had just received an unexpected gift. They made breakfast together, an activity so mundane that Victoria's former self would have dismissed it as beneath her attention. But there was nothing mundane about watching Lily crack eggs with careful concentration. Nothing ordinary about the flour that somehow ended up on both their faces. Nothing routine about the laughter that emerged when Victoria's pancake flipping attempt sent batter across the expensive countertop. Lily taught her mother signs throughout the process. Egg, milk, stir, hot. The words accumulated in Victoria's mind like the beginning of a vocabulary she was desperate to expand. When they sat down to eat, Victoria noticed that Lily had positioned Mr. Buttons at the table as if the bear were a third member of their family. The gesture prompted a question that had been forming since the previous night when Victoria had realized how little she knew about the most important relationship in her daughter's life. Who gave you Mr. Buttons? Victoria asked, pointing at the bear, and then signing the question mark she had observed Lily use. Lily's expression softened into something more complex, memories passing behind her eyes. Her hands moved in a sequence Victoria could not follow, but the emotion underlying the gestures needed no translation. There was love there and loss, and something that looked like sacred memory. Victoria pulled out her phone and typed a message, then showed the screen to Lily. Please tell me, I want to know. Lily studied her mother's face for a long moment, conducting some assessment that Victoria could feel but not interpret. Then she began to sign slowly enough that Victoria could follow the shapes, if not the meanings, her expression carrying the weight of a story she had not been asked to share in a very long time. Victoria watched helplessly, recognizing that her daughter was telling her something important and lacking the tools to receive it properly. The frustration mounted until she made a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. She picked up her phone and called Graham Callahan. The maintenance worker answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone uncertain why he was receiving a Christmas morning call from a CEO. I need your help, Victoria said, the words carrying more weight than the simple request they formed. Lily is trying to tell me something about her bear, about who gave it to her, and I cannot understand. Would you be willing to translate? I can put you on speaker. There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that contained calculation, indecision. Then Graham's voice returned with a warmth that suggested he understood exactly what Victoria was trying to do. Put me on speaker. I will help. Victoria positioned the phone on the table and nodded to Lily, who regarded the device with the curious attention of a child seeing technology deployed in a new way. When Victoria signed for her to continue, Lily resumed her story, her hands moving with the confidence of someone finally being heard. Graham's translation came through the phone's speaker, his voice soft with the reverence of someone conveying something sacred. She says the bear was a gift from her grandmother, your mother Victoria. given to Lily on her 4th birthday. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. Her mother had died 4 years ago, a heart attack that had taken her between one breath and the next. Victoria had handled the arrangements with the efficiency she applied to all difficult logistics, compartmentalizing the grief until it became a background ache she rarely acknowledged. Graham continued translating as Lily signed. She says her grandmother called the bear Mr. Buttons because of his eyes. She says her grandmother promised to learn sign language so they could talk, really talk without anyone translating. Victoria's vision blurred with tears she had not felt forming. Her mother had never mentioned this plan. In all their conversations during those final months, Margaret Sterling had said nothing about learning to sign, about wanting to communicate directly with her granddaughter. Lily was still signing her expression, carrying an intensity that demanded attention. She says her grandmother enrolled in a class, Graham translated, his voice cracking slightly over the words. At a community center in Brooklyn. She went to 3 sessions before she died. Lily knows because she found the notebook after. The notebook where her grandmother was practicing the letters of Lily's name. The revelation landed like a physical blow, driving the breath from Victoria's lungs. Her mother had been trying. Her mother had been learning. Her mother had understood what Victoria had been too busy to recognize, that loving someone meant meeting them where they were, rather than waiting for them to become someone easier to reach. There is more, Graham said gently. Should I continue? Victoria nodded, then remembered he could not see her. Yes, please. Lily's hands moved again, shaping the words that Graham carried across the connection like precious cargo. She says she kept the bear because it reminds her that someone wanted to learn, that someone thought she was worth the effort. She says she used to pretend that Mr. Buttons could talk to her in sign language that her grandmother had finished teaching him before she died. Victoria stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as emotions she had suppressed for years demanded release. She walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered city, while tears streamed down her face in silent testimony to everything she had lost and everything she had failed to see. Behind her, she heard Lily move the soft footsteps of a child, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. Victoria turned to find her daughter standing with Mr. Buttons clutched to her chest, watching her mother cry with an expression that held no judgment, only concern. Victoria knelt on the cold floor, bringing herself to Lily's level. She signed the words she knew inadequate as they were. Love, home, family. Then she added something new, a gesture she had seen Lily make but never understood, touching her heart, then pressing both palms together. Lily's eyes widened with recognition. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Victoria's neck, pressing Mr. Buttons between them, the same way she had at the restaurant, but this time the embrace carried a different quality. Not the desperate clinging of a child seeking temporary comfort, but the settling in of someone who had finally found what they were looking for. Victoria held her daughter in the gray light of Christmas morning, crying for her mother and for herself and for all the years she had wasted building walls when she should have been building bridges. On the phone, Graham Callahan waited in respectful silence, understanding that some moments required witnesses, but not participants. The days following Christmas passed in a blur of activity that would have seemed impossible to Victoria's former self. She attended meetings and handled calls and navigated the corporate fallout from Douglas Harrington's exposure with the competence her shareholders expected. But she also left the office at 5 every evening, a boundary she had never previously respected. She sat with Lily during dinner, struggling to follow conversations in a language she was desperately trying to learn. She read bedtime stories, holding the book at an angle that allowed Lily to see both the pictures and her mother's face. Jonathan Hayes called on December 28th with a preliminary report that confirmed what Victoria had suspected. Douglas Harrington's conspiracy extended deeper than the events at the Gilded Oak, encompassing 2 years of systematic efforts to undermine Victoria's leadership and position himself as the obvious successor. The evidence Jonathan had assembled would support both corporate removal and civil litigation, with potential criminal referrals depending on how prosecutors assessed the electrical sabotage that could have injured guests or staff. Meredith Walsh had been terminated the morning after Christmas, her belongings boxed and delivered to an address in New Jersey, where she had retreated to assess her options. Victoria felt no satisfaction in the dismissal, only a weary recognition that Meredith had chosen her path and would now walk wherever it led. More surprising was the call from Richard Caldwell on December 29th, the investor's gravelly voice carrying a warmth that had been absent during their formal negotiations at the restaurant. I have been thinking about our conversation, Caldwell said, about the things you told your daughter in front of all those witnesses. I have encountered many executives who claim to value family over business, but you are one of the few I have seen prove it when the stakes were real. Victoria shifted the phone against her ear, uncomfortable with praise for decisions that still felt more like accident than intention. I did not plan any of what happened. I just stopped pretending that the things I was pretending did not matter. Caldwell's laugh was dry but genuine. That is exactly what I mean. Planning is easy. Authenticity under pressure is rare. I spoke with Margaret Whitmore this morning. She feels the same. We would like to move forward with the investment on accelerated terms, subject to the usual due diligence. The news should have triggered the satisfaction Victoria associated with professional achievement, the validation that came from closing deals and exceeding expectations. Instead, she felt something more complicated, a recognition that the victory was incomplete without the person whose crisis had precipitated it. There is something I want to include in the partnership terms, Victoria said. Accessibility initiatives. Real ones, not just compliance checkboxes. I want our products and spaces to work for people like my daughter, and I want to hire people who understand what that actually means. Caldwell was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something Victoria had not heard from him before. My daughter Catherine runs a nonprofit focused on educational accessibility for children with learning differences. I would be happy to connect you with her resources if that would be helpful. The offer expanded Victoria's understanding of the man she had been negotiating with. Caldwell was not merely an investor evaluating returns. He was a father who had walked a similar path and recognized in Victoria someone who was finally ready to begin the journey. I would appreciate that, Victoria said. And Richard, thank you, not just for the investment, for seeing something worth believing in. We all need someone to see us, Caldwell replied. Your daughter taught me that watching her stand up in that restaurant. Children are often wiser than the adults who think they are protecting them. Victoria called Graham that afternoon with an offer more structured than her impulsive proposal at the restaurant. She had worked with her HR director to create a position that would leverage Graham's technical expertise and his understanding of accessibility needs part-time initially, but with potential for growth. The salary was generous without being insulting, the hours flexible enough to accommodate Wyatt's schedule. Graham listened to the offer in characteristic silence, asking clarifying questions that revealed a mind more analytical than his humble demeanor suggested. When he finally responded, his voice carried the careful consideration of a man who had learned that opportunities often came with hidden costs. I have to think about what this means for Wyatt, Graham said. He has had enough disruption in his life. I will not make a decision that adds more instability, even if the opportunity seems good. Victoria understood the calculation better now than she would have a week earlier. Take whatever time you need. The offer will remain open regardless of how long you require. 3 days later, on New Year's Eve, Graham called to accept. The community center in Brooklyn occupied a converted warehouse on a street lined with bare trees and parked cars crusted with gray snow. Victoria found the building on the afternoon of January 7th, 2 weeks after the night that had changed everything. She had done her research with the thoroughness she applied to all important projects, identifying the program her mother had enrolled in 4 years earlier and registering for the same introductory sign language class. The classroom was smaller than Victoria had expected, filled with folding chairs arranged in a loose semicircle around an instructor's table. 8 other students had already claimed seats when Victoria arrived, their demographic diversity suggesting a range of motivations for learning: an elderly man with hearing aids, a young couple holding hands, a teenager who might have been Wyatt's age, others whose stories Victoria could not immediately guess. The instructor introduced herself as Dana, a hearing woman in her 50s, who had learned sign language to communicate with a brother who had become deaf in his 20s. Her movements were fluid and precise, her face expressive in ways that hearing people rarely developed. We are going to start with the basics, Dana signed and spoke simultaneously. The alphabet, common words, the grammar structures that make ASL different from English. This is not a fast process. Fluency takes years, but every word you learn is a door that opens to someone who has been waiting for you to knock. Victoria copied the signs Dana demonstrated, her fingers moving through positions that felt awkward and unfamiliar. The alphabet came first, 26 shapes that combined to spell any word, but conveyed none of the natural rhythm of the language itself. Then basic vocabulary: hello, goodbye, thank you, please. the building blocks of courtesy in any tongue. She practiced during breaks, running through the signs with the obsessive repetition she had previously reserved for memorizing financial data. The elderly man with hearing aids noticed her intensity and smiled, his own practice equally dedicated. "Grandchild," he said when she caught his eye, 4 years old, born deaf. "I want to be able to talk to her before she gets too fast for an old man to follow." Victoria thought of her own mother sitting in the same room 4 years earlier, learning the same alphabet with the same determination. Margaret Sterling had died before completing even the basics, her notebook filled with shaky attempts at letters she would never form for her granddaughter. Daughter Victoria said the word catching in her throat. 8 years old. "I should have started learning the day she was diagnosed." The man nodded with the understanding of someone who had confronted similar regrets. "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today." Victoria carried those words home with her, turning them over in her mind like a stone smoothed by water. She had spent so many years cataloging the ways she had failed Lily, using the magnitude of her neglect as an excuse to avoid the effort of remediation. The man's proverb cut through that logic with the simplicity of truth. It was too late to start earlier, but it was not too late to start now. Lily was practicing piano when Victoria arrived at the penthouse, her small fingers moving across the keys with the concentration of someone who experienced music through vibration rather than sound. Graham had explained that many deaf individuals develop profound sensitivity to rhythm and resonance, perceiving musical elements that hearing people often overlooked. Victoria watched from the doorway, unwilling to interrupt the absorption that had transformed her daughter's face into something approaching meditation. The piano had been Lily's request, articulated through the specialist who managed her educational program. Victoria had approved the purchase and arranged for lessons without ever asking why Lily wanted to play. Now, watching her daughter's hands move across the instrument, Victoria understood something she had been missing. Lily was not learning piano despite her deafness. She was experiencing piano through her deafness, accessing a dimension of the music that Victoria's hearing could not perceive. The piece concluded, and Lily turned to find her mother watching. Her expression shifted through the familiar sequence of caution and assessment before settling into something warmer, a tentative welcome that carried none of the reservation Victoria had grown accustomed to seeing. Victoria signed what she had practiced during the drive home, her fingers forming shapes that Dana had drilled into her muscle memory. "Beautiful music. I felt it from the door." Lily's eyes widened with surprise that evolved into delight. Her response came too quickly for Victoria to follow, but the emotion behind it needed no translation. Slow Victoria signed the word, one of the few she trusted herself to produce correctly. "Please slow for me." Lily repeated her message with exaggerated precision, her face carrying the patience of a teacher working with a willing but struggling student. Victoria caught fragments, something about practice, something about tomorrow, something that might have been a question about dinner. The communication was imperfect, riddled with gaps and guesses, and the frustration of two people speaking different dialects of human connection. But it was communication nonetheless, the first authentic exchange between mother and daughter that had not required an intermediary. Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back, unwilling to let emotion derail the moment. She signed the only response she was certain would convey her meaning: "I love you." Lily's smile was answer enough. January 1st arrived with the particular quality of light that distinguished New York winters, the sun struggling through clouds that promised more snow by evening. Victoria had spent the morning in her home office, handling the reduced workflow that the holiday provided before emerging to begin preparations for the dinner she had planned. Graham and Wyatt arrived at 4 o'clock, the man carrying a salad bowl, and the boy clutching a paper bag that rustled with mysterious contents. They navigated the penthouse's entrance with the tentative respect of visitors conscious of the wealth surrounding them, their winter coats dripping snowmelt onto marble floors. Victoria suddenly wished she had covered with something more welcoming. Wyatt made a beeline for Lily, the two children falling into conversation with the ease of friends reunited after an absence that felt longer than a week. Their hands moved in the flowing dialogue Victoria was learning to recognize, if not understand, a private language that excluded the adults but harmed no one with its exclusion. Graham set the salad bowl on the kitchen counter and surveyed the preparations Victoria had made. The scene bore little resemblance to the efficient catering arrangements she usually ordered for the rare occasions when she entertained. This was something messier and more personal: sauce on the stove and vegetables on cutting boards, and a cookbook open to a page spotted with evidence of actual use. "You are cooking," Graham observed the statement carrying a question beneath its surface. Victoria wiped her hands on an apron she had purchased specifically for this occasion. Attempting to cook. Lily wanted something homemade, and I realized I have never actually cooked for her before. The admission cost her something, the acknowledgement of another absence in her catalog of maternal failures. There were always caterers or nannies who handled meals or delivery services that made the whole question irrelevant. Graham moved to the counter without being asked, his hands finding tasks with the competence of someone accustomed to managing domestic responsibilities alone. "What can I help with?" They worked side by side in a kitchen designed for professional chefs, two people from different worlds, collaborating on something as mundane as dinner preparation. Victoria found herself describing her classes at the community center, the signs she was learning the difficulty of training her mind to think in grammar structures that inverted everything she knew about language. "It takes time," Graham said, his hands busy with vegetables, while his voice carried the reassurance of experience. "Wyatt and I practiced for months before we could have real conversations. The important thing is that Lily sees you trying. She has spent 8 years watching people give up on communicating with her. Watching you persist means more than perfection ever could." The words landed with the weight of truth Victoria was still learning to accept. She had spent her career pursuing excellence, driving herself and others towards standards that left no room for mediocrity. The notion that effort mattered more than achievement challenged assumptions that had governed her approach to everything since childhood. "There is something I have been practicing," Victoria said, her voice carrying a vulnerability she had not planned to reveal. "A sentence. I want to say it to Lily tonight, if I can get it right." Graham set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "Show me." Victoria positioned her hands the way Dana had demonstrated, forming each sign with the careful deliberation of someone constructing something fragile. The sentence emerged in pieces. "You then everything," then a construction that Dana had taught her, conveyed to me in ASL grammar. Graham watched the signs with an expression that softened as their meaning registered. "That is beautiful. And your form is good, better than I would have expected after 2 weeks." "I have been practicing every spare moment," Victoria admitted. "In meetings under the table where no one can see, in the car, in the bathroom mirror. I want to get it right." Graham nodded with the understanding of someone who had walked the same path. "You will get it right because it matters to you. That is how we learn the things that are worth learning." Dinner was served at 6, the four of them gathered around a table that had never hosted this particular configuration before. Victoria had arranged the seating, deliberately positioning herself across from Lily, where they could see each other's faces, with Graham and Wyatt flanking the space between them. The food was imperfect in ways Victoria's usual catered meals never were. The chicken had cooked unevenly, some pieces slightly dry, while others bordered on underdone. The vegetables were more al dente than she had intended. The bread was store-bought because her attempt at homemade rolls had produced objects more suitable for construction than consumption. But the children ate without complaint, Wyatt narrating the meal's qualities to Lily in sign, while occasionally translating for Victoria's benefit. The elaborate paper bag he had carried turned out to contain handmade ornaments, snowflakes cut from construction paper and decorated with glitter that shed across the table like artificial snow. Lily received the gifts with the ceremonial appreciation of someone unused to presents from peers. She examined each snowflake with careful attention, her fingers tracing the cut patterns, while Wyatt explained the techniques he and his father had developed during their years of holiday crafting. Graham shared stories Victoria had not heard, narratives from his life with Catherine that painted a portrait of a family defined not by wealth but by presence. The apartment they had shared in a Brooklyn walk-up, barely large enough for 3 people, and too small once Wyatt's toys began multiplying. The vacations they had taken to state parks within driving distance because airfare was never in the budget. The traditions they had established around holidays, birthdays, ordinary Tuesdays, that became extraordinary through the simple alchemy of attention. Catherine would have loved this, Graham said, his voice carrying the particular texture of grief that had transformed over years into something more like gratitude. She believed that families were not born, but made, that the people you chose to love were more important than the people you happened to share blood with. Victoria thought about her own mother, about the notebook filled with practice letters for Lily's name, about the community center classes Margaret Sterling had attended without telling anyone. Her mother had been trying to make family in the way Graham described reaching across barriers that Victoria had been too busy to notice. My mother was learning sign language before she died. Victoria said, the admission feeling like confession and tribute simultaneously. I only found out a few days ago, Lily told me. She has known for 4 years and never had anyone to share it with. Graham's expression shifted into understanding that required no words. The children learn to carry things alone when they do not trust the adults to handle what they carry. It is not a criticism of you. It is a survival strategy they develop when the world keeps proving unreliable. Victoria watched Lily and Wyatt signing across the table, their conversation animated with the energy of children who had found unexpected kinship. She had spent 8 years trying to fix her daughter's deafness, managing specialists and technologies and interventions designed to make Lily more compatible with a hearing world. She had never considered that Lily might not need fixing, that what she needed instead was acceptance and connection and the simple gift of being seen. The meal concluded with a dessert Victoria had wisely purchased rather than attempted to produce. Apple pie from a bakery Graham recommended, served with vanilla ice cream, that Wyatt declared to be the superior brand based on criteria he did not elaborate. Lily ate her portion with the methodical appreciation of someone savoring something precious. After dinner, the children retreated to Lily's room, where Wyatt had promised to teach her a card game their family played on New Year's Eve. Victoria heard their footsteps on the stairs, followed by the muffled sounds of movement and the occasional burst of laughter that penetrated the floor between them. Graham helped with the dishes, his hands moving through the familiar rhythms of domestic maintenance, while Victoria dried and stored the items he cleaned. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that develops between people who have moved past the need to fill every moment with words. I never thanked you properly, Victoria said as they finished, for everything that happened at the restaurant, for teaching me those first signs, for showing me what I was missing. Graham set the last pot in the drying rack and turned to face her. You do not owe me thanks for being kind to a child who needed kindness. That is not a favor, it is a baseline of decent behavior. Victoria shook her head, unwilling to let him minimize his impact. It was more than that. You showed me that the distance between Lily and me was a choice I was making, not a condition I was forced to accept. You demonstrated that connection was possible if I was willing to do the work. Graham dried his hands on a towel, his expression thoughtful. I showed you what Catherine showed me years ago when Wyatt first lost his hearing. She was the one who insisted we learn sign language together, who refused to let our fear of inadequacy become an excuse for abandonment. Everything I know about loving a child through difficulty, I learned from her. The mention of his wife carried weight, that Victoria was learning to recognize the particular gravity of loss that transformed over time, but never fully dissipated. She saw in Graham's face the same struggle she felt in her own heart, the effort to honor what was gone while remaining present for what remained. She sounds remarkable, Victoria said. Graham's smile carried warmth and sorrow in equal measure. She was. And she would have been proud to see what happened at that restaurant. The children standing up for what was right when the adults were too compromised to act. Victoria thought about Lily in that moment, signing her truth before a room full of people who did not understand her language but could not ignore her message. Her daughter had demonstrated courage that Victoria was only beginning to comprehend, the bravery of speaking up when everyone expected you to stay silent. I need to tell her something, Victoria said. The sentence I have been practicing. Would you stay in case I need help? Graham nodded with the quiet support of someone who understood the magnitude of what she was attempting. I will be here. They found the children in Lily's room, the card game abandoned in favor of a more pressing project. Lily was showing Wyatt the photographs on her dresser, signing explanations that Victoria could not follow, but could imagine from the context. These were the people who had populated her daughter's life while Victoria was absent, the caregivers and teachers and therapists who had stepped into the space a mother should have occupied. Victoria knocked on the door frame to announce her presence, waiting until both children turned before entering. Lily's expression shifted into the cautious assessment. Victoria was learning to read the evaluation of whether this interruption represented opportunity or threat. Lily Victoria signed the name, a sequence of letters she had practiced until her fingers could form them without conscious thought. I want to tell you something. Graham moved to the corner of the room, present but unobtrusive, his positioning offering support without interference. Wyatt shifted to stand beside his father. understanding from context that something significant was about to happen. Victoria knelt in front of her daughter, bringing herself to eye level the way she had at the restaurant, the way she had on Christmas morning, the way she was learning to position herself for conversations that mattered. Her hands rose to begin the sentence she had practiced thousands of times over the past week. Each sign carried the weight of 8 years of absence, 8 years of missed opportunities, 8 years of love that had never found its proper expression. You are everything to me. The signs emerged with more fluency than Victoria had dared hope for, her fingers forming shapes that Dana had drilled into her muscle memory, that she had rehearsed in bathroom mirrors and under conference tables and during every spare moment her demanding schedule allowed. The sentence was not perfect. Her grammar probably contained errors that a fluent signer would immediately notice, but the meaning was clear. Lily stood motionless, her eyes fixed on her mother's hands, as if unable to believe what she was seeing. 8 years of professional interpreters and specialized communication devices, and carefully managed interactions, and this was the first time her mother had ever said a complete sentence to her in the language that lived inside Lily's mind. Then her daughter's face crumpled, not into sadness, but into something more complicated, the breaking of walls that had been built to protect a heart too often disappointed. Tears spilled down Lily's cheeks as she launched herself into Victoria's arms, the force of the embrace nearly toppling them both. Victoria held her daughter while they both cried, the tears carrying away accumulated grief and regret, and the terrible weight of years spent in parallel isolation. She felt Lily's hands moving against her back, signing something that Victoria could not see, but could feel the rhythm of words she was determined to understand. I love you too, Mama. Graham translated softly from the corner, his voice rough with emotion he was not attempting to hide. She says she has been waiting. She says she knew you would learn eventually. She says Mr. Buttons told her to be patient. Victoria laughed through her tears, the sound carrying all the complexity of a moment she had not known she needed until it arrived. She held Lily tighter, feeling her daughter's heartbeat against her own two rhythms, synchronizing into something that felt like the beginning of a family. Wyatt approached tentatively, offering a tissue from the box on Lily's dresser. His expression held the particular combination of awkwardness and compassion that characterized children confronted with adult emotions they did not fully understand, but recognized as important. Victoria accepted the tissue with a smile that included him in the moment rather than excluding him from it. Thank you, Wyatt, for being such a good friend to Lily. The boy shrugged with the affected casualness of a 10-year-old unused to direct compliments. She is easy to be friends with. Most people just do not bother to figure that out. The simplicity of his assessment cut through Victoria's remaining defenses. Most people just do not bother. She had been one of those people for 8 years, too busy or too afraid or too convinced that her daughter's difference made connection impossible. Wyatt, a child with no special training and no professional expertise, had achieved in hours what Victoria had avoided for nearly a decade. The evening wound down with the gradual deceleration that characterized all good gatherings, conversations trailing into comfortable silences, energy slowly dissipating into the settled warmth of connection established and confirmed. Graham collected Wyatt at 9 o'clock, the boy protesting bedtime with the universal reluctance of children who had found something worth staying awake for. Victoria walked them to the elevator, Lily beside her, their hands joined in the unconscious connection that had become natural over the past 2 weeks. Thank you, Victoria said to Graham, the words carrying weight accumulated over many conversations and revelations. For accepting the job, for coming tonight, for everything. Graham pressed the elevator button and turned to face her. Thank you for seeing something worth hiring. Not everyone looks past the uniform to find what is underneath. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Wyatt bounded inside with the energy of a child finally released from adult supervision. Graham followed more slowly, his hand finding his son's shoulder in the unconscious gesture of parental connection. See you Monday, Graham said as the doors began to close. We have a lot of work to do, buildings to assess, systems to redesign. Victoria nodded, feeling the weight and the promise of the words. Yes, a lot of work. The doors closed and Victoria stood with her daughter in the quiet hallway, listening to the elevator descend through floors that represented wealth she had spent her career accumulating. The penthouse waited behind them, its expensive spaces transformed over the past 2 weeks from a showcase of success into something approaching a home. Ready for bed, Victoria signed the question, emerging with more confidence than she had felt even hours earlier. Lily shook her head, then signed something Victoria could not follow. The girl rolled her eyes with the exaggerated patience of a child dealing with a slow-learning adult, then took her mother's hand and led her toward her bedroom. The meaning became clear when they arrived. Lily wanted Victoria to read her a bedtime story. The books on the nightstand weighted their pages filled with words and images that Victoria had never shared with her daughter because she had always delegated this task to others. Victoria selected a book and settled onto Lily's bed, her daughter curling beside her, with Mr. Buttons positioned between them. The reading was halting and imperfect, Victoria's signing vocabulary insufficient to convey the story's full meaning. But Lily helped, teaching signs for unfamiliar words, correcting grammar with gentle persistence, transforming the reading into a collaboration rather than a performance. By the time the story concluded, Lily's eyes had grown heavy with approaching sleep. Victoria closed the book and placed it on the nightstand, then sat watching her daughter drift toward dreams with the peaceful expression of a child who finally felt safe. "You are everything to me." Victoria signing the words again quietly, more to herself than to the sleeping child. The sentence had become a prayer, a promise, a declaration of intent that she would spend the rest of her life fulfilling. She rose from the bed, carefully unwilling to disturb the peace that had settled over her daughter. At the doorway she paused, looking back at the scene she had witnessed so rarely over the past 8 years. Lily asleep, Mr. Buttons beside her, the ornaments Wyatt had made catching light from the hall. The life Victoria had constructed before this Christmas seemed distant, now a photograph of someone she no longer recognized. The woman who had walked into the Gilded Oak 2 weeks earlier, calculating angles and managing impressions, and treating her own daughter as a liability to be minimized, had been replaced by someone Victoria was still learning to become. There would be challenges ahead. The sign language class met twice weekly, and Victoria was only beginning the years of study that fluency would require. Her company faced restructuring in the wake of Douglas Harrington's removal, strategic decisions that would demand her attention and her energy. The relationship with Graham was undefined, carrying potential for something she was not yet ready to name. But none of those challenges felt insurmountable anymore. Victoria had discovered something in that restaurant corridor, watching her daughter laugh with strangers who spoke her language, that had transformed her understanding of what mattered. The most important language was not the one you were born speaking. It was the one you chose to learn because someone you loved was worth the effort. Victoria turned off the hallway light and walked through her penthouse toward her own bedroom. Outside the windows, Manhattan sparkled with the lights of a million lives she would never know, each one containing stories as complicated and as simple as her own. Tomorrow she would wake early and practice her signs before the day's demands began. She would call the community center to inquire about advanced classes, about tutoring, about any resource that could accelerate her learning. She would send an email to Catherine Caldwell Richards' daughter, beginning a conversation about accessibility initiatives that could transform her company into something more than a profit-generating machine. But tonight, on this first night of a new year, Victoria Sterling stood at her bedroom window and felt something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. Hope. Not the strategic optimism she projected in boardrooms and investor meetings, the manufactured confidence that masked calculation. This was something rawer and more vulnerable, the tender shoot of possibility emerging from soil she had believed was barren. Lily was sleeping down the hall with Mr. Buttons beside her, dreaming whatever dreams filled the minds of children who had finally found what they were looking for. Graham was riding the subway home to Brooklyn with Wyatt dozing against his shoulder, planning the work they would begin on Monday. Somewhere in the city, other families were marking the New Year's beginning with their own private celebrations, their own declarations of hope and intent. Victoria formed the signs in the darkness of her bedroom, practicing the words that had finally found their voice. "You are everything to me." The city glittered outside her window, indifferent to her transformation, continuing its eternal dance of ambition and accident and occasional grace. Snow had begun to fall again, adding fresh white to the accumulation of the past weeks, covering the evidence of the year that had ended. Victoria watched the snow descend and felt for the first time in years that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had achieved what she set out to achieve, not because her company was secure or her reputation intact or her position unassailable, because she had finally learned to see her daughter. And in seeing Lily, she had discovered something about herself that all her professional success had never revealed. Love was not a problem to be solved or a project to be managed. Love was a language, one that required constant practice and frequent failure, and the humility to start over every time the words came out wrong. Victoria was finally ready to begin learning.